In this PowerPoint, we're talking about shutter speed in motion, and I wanted to start with this photograph of the horses that you can see done by Edward Muybridge back in 1878. It was actually a series of photographs taken with 12 different cameras to be able to capture the horse in motion like this. And it was originally done for Governor Leland Stanford in California, who wanted to prove that when a horse is running, all 4 feet leave the ground. So Muybridge had to devise a camera that was able to capture a very short shutter speed to be able to capture a still image of the horse as it was going by. And he set up 12 cameras to be able to capture a series of the images of the horse as it was running. And you can see in the photographs that you can find ones where the horse actually does have all 4 feet off of the ground during its stride. So shutter speeds are basically one of the controls that we have for exposure in our cameras. And the shutter is basically a device that opens and closes to be able to let light through into the camera. It's kind of like a valve. It's basically either open or closed, and we're basically determining how long that valve or the shutter is open. And in the diagram here, you can see that shorter shutter speeds are generally talked about in fractions of a second, where 1/8,000th is the shortest most cameras will use for being able to take a photograph. And it goes all the way down into the seconds, where in this case it's 30 seconds, which is the longest most cameras have set in them for taking photographs. The shorter the shutter stays open, we see that there's less light hitting the camera lens, camera shutter. As the shutter is staying open, we see more light hitting the camera sensor. We also see that it changes how our images look in the shutter speed that we're using as well. The shorter the shutter speed, we tend to freeze the motion or the action of the photographs, whereas longer shutter speeds tend to show more blurring or show the action in more of a different way. You'll also see, sometimes we may see some differences when we're using different ISOs to be able to achieve these faster shutter speeds. So sometimes we may see a little bit more noise in our photographs when we're using long exposures as compared to shorter exposures. So here's an example showing the plane coming off of the aircraft carrier. And again, really kind of cool. It stops the motion, very fast shutter speed, tends to freeze the action in the photograph. In the next one here, we have the hammer breaking the light bulb, and we can see how the shutter speed is really fast and is stopping the motion of the pieces of glass as they're flying through the air. Here's another example taken on a trip to Lake Placid in New York State, where this is at where they do ski jumping, and during the wintertime they do have the contest in different events for ski jumping for distance. In this case, this was in the summer and at a summer camp where the students were actually jumping from the ramp, but they were literally jumping into a swimming pool. But we can see how we've been able to capture them in midair and stopping the motion in the photographs. So faster the shutter speed is, more likely we are going to stop the action in the photos. Here's another example, kind of showing at 1/1000th of a second, stopping the action of the go-kart as it's going around the track. So what happens when we use slower shutter speeds? Well, slower shutter speeds are going to show more blurring in the picture. Okay, and in general, it sometimes will actually kind of emphasize motion within the picture if we're careful with it. So here's an example in the photograph of the go-karts where one's taken at 1/500th of a second, shorter shutter speed, stops the action more so, whereas at 1/40th of a second we see more blurring in the photo. It may actually look like he's going faster because of that blurring that we see in the picture. Here's an example that shows 4 different shutter speeds and how it affects the blurring within the pictures. So we have at 1/1000th of a second stopping the action, 2/50th we're stopping some of the action, but we see some blurring going on in the background. 1/40th of a second, we really start seeing the background get blurry behind. And then at 1/15th, we see a lot of blurring and motion in the photograph itself. Now, in the examples that we see here, we're actually panning the camera. And panning is where you follow the subject to be able to make sure it stays relatively sharp, and then the background is blurry behind. We can even use longer shutter speeds, sometimes into the seconds, to be able to show photographs at night. And in this case, you can see the taillights of the cars as they're going down the street and creating kind of a blurring pattern behind them. I like taking photographs of water, and many times I'll use slower shutter speeds because I think it gives the water more of a flowing look, more of a smooth and showing that motion of the water as it's moving there too. Here's another example using the zipper, and in this photograph you can see how it's moving around in a circle, really kind of creating this kind of spirograph pattern in the background in the photo. Other cases, we may take pictures of fireworks, and in many cases with fireworks we may be using an exposure of 1 second or longer to be able to show the bursting and kind of that flower shape of the fireworks too. A lot of times we use those slower shutter speeds to show motion in the photos. Here are the bicycle riders, we're panning with them, and we can really see some action and motion in the photo. Down in the bottom we see the people walking on the street, and in this case the camera is still like on a tripod, and the people are moving, so they become kind of ghosts in the photo. Another example, long exposure, long shutter speed. This one taken in several minutes, maybe even in an hour exposure time here, to be able to create the blurring of the stars as they're moving through the sky. Again, sometimes we may use some motion with our camera when we're taking pictures. So like panning the camera means you're following your subject. The little girl in the top left, we can see we're kind of following her as she's running in the field. Same thing with the other subjects as they're walking and moving. We create this feeling of action and motion in our pictures. And we're doing this intentionally to be able to create that kind of look with a camera. Now, occasionally we do use the slow shutter speed and we get what we didn't intend on, which is a blurry picture overall. And I'm sure many of us have taken blurry photographs like this. Unintentional blur caused by camera shake. If you're using slow shutter speeds below a 60th of a second, use a tripod to help prevent this. On some of our cameras we may see a setting for B or bulb mode on our camera. In the cameras back in the 1800s, they would use a kind of a remote for firing the shutter. That was a pneumatic one where they would use a bulb. You'd squeeze the bulb and the air from the bulb would open the shutter, and when you released it, it would close the shutter. So the bulb mode is basically where you're triggering the shutter and it will stay open as long as you hold down the button on the camera. Or if you're using a remote release, like the one pictured on the right here, you can use that to be able to help control for longer exposures, even like the star trails, where you can do photographs for a very long period of time. So if you're hand holding your camera, there are some limits that you want to use for being able to help make sure that your photographs stay as sharp as possible. Generally speaking, you want to use a shutter speed of a 60th of a second or faster. Or you can use kind of the rule of thumb based on the focal length of the lens that you're using, whereas if you're using like a 50 or 60 millimeter, you'd want to use 1/60th of a second. If you're using more of a telephoto lens, like a 250 millimeter, you want to use a minimum of 1/250th of a second. These will help you keep from getting that unintentional camera shake when you're trying to take your photographs. Other things that you can do if you're using slightly slower shutter speeds is use that tripod or a monopod, or you can use where you're setting your camera like on the camera bag, or you can also be able to set it on a fence post or something that's going to be able to help hold the camera steady, and then use the self timer that you have on the camera or the remote release to be able to take your photograph. So to kind of recap what we've been talking about, faster or shorter shutter speeds will tend to stop the action. Slower shutter speeds will tend to show more blurring in the picture. Sometimes we use those slower shutter speeds and blurring to be able to create a look to the photograph. In some cases we may pan the camera or tilt the camera or zoom in with the camera to be able to create that blurring look. We can help steady our cameras by bracing ourselves better when we're taking the photograph, using a tripod or a monopod to help brace the camera itself, or sometimes we can use a fence post or something to set it onto to be able to take those photographs. Use your remote release that you may have for your camera or the self timer to be able to take your hands off the camera and keep it really good and steady. Or you can use the bulb release to be able to take really long exposure times.